Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Real Talk podcast. I'm your host, Tehran, and as always, I'm joined by my brilliant co-host, Roxana. Today, we have a very insightful episode planned for you all with a renowned scholar of Islam who needs no introduction. He was once deemed the unofficial spokesperson in English for mainstream Salafism, and in a 2011 New York Times Magazine 10,000 word cover story, described him as a rock star of Western Salafism with over a dozen publications under his name, including the one that has just been released, which we'll be discussing in this episode, titled Understanding Salafism, Seeking the Path of the Pious Predecessors. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Shaykh Yasir Qadhi to our platform. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Qadhi, and thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to speak about your latest publication.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much. The pleasure is mine, alhamdulillah. It's my genuine pleasure to be interviewed by the both of you. Just a quick question. My apologies, your channel is a bit new to me. My people just introduced me to it. The interview is coming from a faith-based paradigm, or is it more academically inclined? Just because the same question can be answered multiple ways depending on if you want prescriptive or descriptive answers. So that I'm aware, what is exactly your paradigm on the channel?
Well, our paradigm is more so academically inclined, if that helps.
Okay. Okay. So inshallah, try to be as neutral as possible and try to be fair. And if need be, if I want to make a personal disclaimer based on my own understanding, that'll be put into the context as well, inshallah.
Sounds great.
Okay, great.
And as someone who was actually, in some ways, still an adherent of Salafism, I found your book to be a phenomenal read. It reminded me of many of the classical texts and scholars I used to read from, as well as many of the contemporary scholars and lecturers I used to listen to. But you added far more context and insights than what was available to me at the time of my early days as a new Muslim. But to start off, what motivated you to write this book at this point in your career, and why did you feel it was important to present Salafism with this kind of balanced clarity, both
Mhm.
as a movement you've been a part of and one that's been widely misunderstood by both critics and adherents to a certain extent?
The reason for writing the book is mentioned in the introduction, and that is that uh, around 8 years ago, I met Professor Omid Safi, who's a colleague and a friend of mine, and I was just complaining to him about how unacademic, how superficial almost everything written about Wahhabism or Salafism was. And at the time, I was sympathetic to the movement overall, particularly to Ibn Taymiyyah. I still am in many ways. It's just I've just moved on, but and I just was, bemoaning the fact that there doesn't seem to be a holistic, internal, sympathetic, encyclopedic work. Most works on the movement are extremely superficial, or if they are well written and academic, they concentrate on a very narrow slither or spectrum of the movement, which might have done a good job for that narrow slither, but it doesn't explain the movement as a whole. And I always wanted to see something that explained it to a educated layperson. I mean, my book is published by One World, so it's not Brill, but neither is it, your average paperback. It's 600 pages. Professor Omid said to me, you should write the book, and one thing led to another. And so here is the book. I would humbly like to suggest, without any, inshallah, any arrogance here, that this is a holistic, sympathetic, encyclopedic introduction to the movement. That is a one-stop shop that will do pretty much everything that is needed for the history of the movement, the internal strands of the movement, the relationship of this movement with other mainstream strands and its global networks. I think it gives a very solid introduction overall from a neutral, if not a sympathetic paradigm. And I don't think there's any other book quite like this one. So I'm very happy at also the reviews and the feedback that I'm getting from across the world.
And I'm glad that you mentioned sympathetic because as I was sharing certain excerpts of your book on my social media, the one thing I didn't want people to do is to think that it was some kind of hit piece on Salafism. Because as you know, Salafis sometimes get a bad rap from other Muslims, anything about them. Sometimes you might think it's just to denigrate them. But what reaction to the contents of this book do you expect from contemporary Salafi community and as well as non-Salafi community Muslims?
I mean, obviously, it is understood that because I no longer adhere and because my, sympathetic inclinations are still academic, I do expect there to be, some misunderstanding, some backlash. So be it. Also, quite a lot of ad hominem, which has always been a part of my life with members of that movement. Obviously, ad hominem attacks should not really be given any dignity because people that are susceptible to those types of attacks don't really want intellectual arguments of defense. And it's already begun. Somebody pointed out to me, by the way, an entire critique on, was it Amazon, of the book they hadn't really read even because they're basing it on other lectures here and there. So they critiqued the book without having read the book because it's not available in America right now. And their critiques are based upon their presumptions of what the book might say. And the book doesn't say that. So it's already begun. May I humbly suggest for the critics to actually read the book or the sections of the book they're interested in, and then to make up their own mind. I believe the book is quite factual. And had I still been an adherent to the movement, not much would have changed about the book other than the epilogue in which I become personal, the last 5 pages, the only time I actually become personal. Otherwise, the rest of the book is fairly neutral, fairly descriptive, and there's analysis you can disagree with, and that analysis, whoever wants to disagree with it, well, then bring the other alternative proofs and other analyses, and we can have a discussion back and forth. But I don't view the book at all as a hit piece, as a critique, as a mechanism to denigrate. On the contrary, and I've said this throughout the many years I've been, publicly disassociated from the movement, I've said this, that I've only moved on. I've not become an enemy. I've only moved on from the movement. I've left adherence to any particular interpretation of the faith. The faith transcends sectarianism. And the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a believing Muslim for me is far greater than a small group of scholars who say it only belongs to us. So I'm no longer sectarian. Therefore, when I politely disagree with the movement, it is not because I say another movement is divine. Rather, all movements have good and bad, and all movements are organic. They are affected by and effect social change. And that is one of the key theses of my book. If we can show that Salafism organically involves, which it does, then we can demonstrate that the notion that many Salafis have, that they're basically emulating exactly what people 1,350 years ago practiced and did. If we can demonstrate there's always been a diversity, then automatically that will bring about a level of maturity, humility, and then an empathy with other strands. That is really one of the goals of the book without exception. So it's not denigration, it's not critique, it is hopefully raising the bar and broadening one's horizons and creating an empathy for other movements as well. And by the way, that empathy should also be for non-Salafis about the Salafi movement, because the Salafi movement has roots. One of the, I know we're jumping the gun here, one of the criticisms non-Salafis have is that they believe Salafism came out of thin air. No, the book clearly demonstrates there is a strand that goes back to proto-Sunnism, official Sunnism. There is a strand that you can quite clearly show meanders through all of civilization, all of history, until it, finally is manifested in the modern movement known as Salafism. So it is not completely coming out of thin air. Empathy, humility, humbleness, and a genuine acceptance for a broader spectrum, that is one of the goals of the book.
I mean, while you make it clear in your book that there isn't a direct or teleological continuation of Salafism from the earliest period of Islam to the modern day, you also highlight how certain theological and methodological ideas commonly associated with Salafism have existed since the formative centuries.
Yes.
Building on your previous answer, what are some of the defining characteristics of proto-Salafism amongst early Muslim scholars?
So you find certain characteristics that are pretty much universal throughout all manifestations of the movement. Of them is the primacy of the Quran and the Hadith, not the Sunnah, Hadith, because again, the equation of the books of Hadith with the Sunnah is itself even within Sunnism, contested, right? Imam Malik had a perception of Sunnah, Abu Hanifa had a perception of Sunnah, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Shafi had a perception of Sunnah. And then the Ahl al-Hadith, or the proto-Salafi movement, equated the narrations of hadith with the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and then equating it with the Quran. So giving Quran and the books of hadith an almost equal weight. This is something that one finds in almost all manifestations of Salafism. And when I say Salafism, we're using a term that might not have existed when we describe these movements, but the concepts existed, right? Another manifestation is the rejection of what is called kalam discourse. And kalam discourse has shaped the majority of Muslim theological schools, from Ibadism to Zaydism to Ithna Asharism to Mu'tazilism to Maturidism to obviously Ash'arism. All of these movements have adapted certain principles of kalam and basically formulated a theology based upon those principles. One of the hallmarks of all Salafi movements is the rejection of kalam in toto. They are not interested in the principles and the maxims that are derived from kalam. They're not interested in bodies and accidents and the cosmological kalam argument for the existence of God and its repercussions on the divine attributes. And hence, based upon that, the understanding of the divine attributes in light of the repercussions of the kalam cosmological arguments. If this is a bit too deep for the viewers, they can listen to my library chats and other lectures online where we go into those types of details. But Salafism rejected the kalam cosmological argument, and hence the repercussions of the kalam cosmological arguments, and hence Salafism always viewed the divine attributes in a slightly different manner. And that is the claim that if God says it, it must be right. If Allah describes himself with X, with Y, with Z, well then, the word X, Y, and Z is known to us. And if God used it, if Allah uses it in the Quran, if it's in a hadith that's authentic isnad, well then, God and his messenger know best, and will affirm the wording and leave the modality to God alone. This is, of course, Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding. If you want to get more advanced, there's a spectrum of understanding, but that's Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding. In contrast to this, all kalam movements were a bit more nitpicky. They either, like the Ash'aris and Maturidis, differentiated between these attributes, and they said, okay, for these 7 or 8, we'll follow that rule. We know the wording, we don't know the meaning. But for those that might be potentially misunderstood as anthropomorphic, God's rising over the throne, God's majestic face, the fact that God has 2 hands, bal yadahu mabsutatan, it is impossible that God actually intended the zahir or the literal meaning, as they say, and he must have intended something else. So this distinction of the sifat is unique to kalam. Salafism throughout its entire history did not have this distinction because they're not coming from a kalam-based paradigm. These are some of the main key factors that unite all strands of Salafism.
I mean, you've mentioned him already, and I think that it's somebody that we definitely want to focus on in this interview, is Ibn Taymiyyah's significance to the modern Salafi movement. And you even suggest that maybe, you know, contemporary Salafism might not have existed in the same form without him. Why do you think Ibn Taymiyyah stands so uniquely apart from other proto-Salafi theologians in shaping the movement's trajectory? And what aspects of its theology or methodology come uniquely from him?
So, I mean, firstly, it is palpable, the impact Ibn Taymiyyah has on the movement. It is self-evident and obvious. Every single seminary that is interested in Salafi theology and teaching, the primary books that it assigns is Ibn Taymiyyah, right? And Ibn Taymiyyah remains the most oft commented on and the almost final arbiter and authority on all matters. So anytime you mention a subject or an opinion, you will always find in Salafi discourses, but Ibn Taymiyyah said. Now the question arises why that is the case. And you can answer this in a number of ways. First and foremost, I would say, and this is of course my opinion at the end of the day, Allah knows best, I would say the Salafi movement did not produce pre-modernity any intellectual to the caliber of Ibn Taymiyyah. This is my analysis. I don't know of any pre-modern thinker, pre-modern author, theologian, scholar, who was as educated, as widely read, and clearly as intelligent as Ibn Taymiyyah. So Ibn Taymiyyah becomes, if you like, the unofficial lawyer, spokesperson, defender, extrapolator of, Salafi theology and methodology. Pre-Ibn Taymiyyah, if you read, the works written by almost all, Hanbali theologians, pre-Ibn Taymiyyah, you really find, and I say this gently, what's a polite way to say this? You don't find analysis as much as you find just reports, from the Prophet ﷺ or the Sahaba Tabi'un that are deemed to be definitive in refuting the aspects of kalam. Hence the derogatory term hashawiyya was given to them. Hashawiyya, you're just collecting things and throwing it, right? You're not really addressing the arguments, and you think that quoting a statement, is enough to refute an intellectual argument. Ibn Taymiyyah comes along and pretty much for the first time, really, in Salafi history, actually understands the refutations of Salafism. He understands kalam and falsafa very well. He has read the works of the Falasifa. He has read Al-Razi cover to cover and understands Al-Razi. He has read Ibn Sina. He has read the books of Ibn Sab'in. He has read the very people that he's refuting, and he's understood them. And then he refutes them in a language that is accessible and understandable to the critic. He's not just throwing texts. He's actually deconstructing. He's actually addressing intellectually, logically, rationally. Hence the claim of his opponents that, hey, you modern Salafis, you say you don't like kalam. Ibn Taymiyyah was also a kalam expert. And there's an element of truth to this. I've had this debate back and forth. Ibn Taymiyyah utilized kalam and understood kalam, but Ibn Taymiyyah did not subscribe to kalam. So there's a difference here. But Ibn Taymiyyah was an intellectual genius. He's a towering giant, a well-read, erudite scholar who then defends. And another thing he does, he extrapolates maxims. You will not find maxims that are taught pre-Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah writes Al-Hamawiyya. Ibn Taymiyyah writes Al-Wasatiyya. He writes Al-Tadmuriyya. In these, it's chock full of rules, qawa'id, maxims that can then be utilized and are taught to this day amongst the movement. Another reason why Ibn Taymiyyah is so popular is the fact that he really is a polymath and an author who has written quite literally over 300 volumes. I mean, I don't know if you can see, but Ibn Taymiyyah, all of this is Ibn Taymiyyah behind me. Well, coming up from the 5 sections are just Ibn Taymiyyah, right? The sheer quantity of books Ibn Taymiyyah has written, he is considered to be in the top 3 in terms of sheer quantity of treatises and writings, along with the Tabari and the Suyuti. Like Ibn Taymiyyah is in the top 3 or 4 people in the history of Islam. So there's hardly a topic except that Ibn Taymiyyah has written quite voluminously. He's written about interfaith relationship, refuting, Christianity, 9-10 volumes, medieval theologian refuting Christianity, and actually refuting Christian concepts and doctrines. He's written about, Sunni Shia, and he's written and refuting Al-Alama Al-Hilli, one of the icons of Shi'ism. He's read Al-Hilli cover to cover. He's understood Al-Hilli, and then he deconstructs Al-Hilli in his Manhaj Sunnah. And then, of course, Al-Razi, and my PhD was on Dar al-Ta'arud. One paragraph of Fakhruddin al-Razi, one paragraph, and Ibn Taymiyyah writes 10 volumes to refute that paragraph. And I can go on and on. So put all of these things together. Frankly, pre-modernity, Salafism never saw a mind as educated, as well-read, and as well-written, in terms of sheer quantity as Ibn Taymiyyah. Therefore, the indelible mark that he has left on Salafism, it is literally second to none. And I state Salafism as it exists today would not be recognizable had it not been for Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, I can go on, and one thing needs to be said. This is really important. Ibn Taymiyyah also contributed. Now, this is contentious because Salafis don't want to say this. And it took me a while to even come to terms a few years ago or 10 years ago to really admit this fact, because it's awkward. Salafism likes to believe it's existed like a diamond from the time of Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhu. It's literally been there the whole time, exactly unchanged. The book demonstrates that's not the case. So to claim that Ibn Taymiyyah carved the diamond, shaped the diamond didn't exist before Ibn Taymiyyah, and even the diamond we have today is not the one Ibn Taymiyyah shaped. To claim that goes against the main thesis of Salafism, but that's a factually correct statement. So what did Ibn Taymiyyah do? Quite a lot. And actually, I'm writing a paper one day, and hopefully it'll be published, about the contributions of Ibn Taymiyyah to Salafi thought. I've actually presented in multiple academic conferences the prototypes of this paper. I'll mention, I don't know, 2 or 3, how much time we have. These ideas are seminal to modern Salafism. They didn't exist pre-Ibn Taymiyyah. Number 1, the tripartite definition of Tawheed. Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, Uluhiyyah, Asma' al-Sifat. Ibn Taymiyyah is the first to mainstream this entire concept. Pause here, footnote. Salafis like to point out, oh, so-and-so before Ibn Taymiyyah barely referenced these 3 concepts. Response to this, yes, there is a reference pre-Ibn Taymiyyah, but it was not a core doctrine. And the way Ibn Taymiyyah interpreted it is unique to him. So, number 1, the tripartite distinction. This leads to number 2, which is Ibn Taymiyyah's unique understanding of Asma' al-Sifat, of the divine attributes. It is quite clear, and actually advanced Salafi students know this, that pre-Ibn Taymiyyah there was a spectrum of how to understand the attributes. Some of the Hanabila were actually very anthropomorphic, right? Such as Al-Qadhi Abu Ya'la. It's basically almost bordering on giving God corporeal, God sits on the throne. The throne creaks when God sits on it. There's a narration.
I was surprised reading that. I remember hearing these allegations early on.
It's in his book. Go read it. It's in his book, Qadhi Abu Ya'la, Ibtal Ta'wilat, and Akhbar al-Sifat. He has a narration, and again, he doesn't comment on it. I mean, he has a narration of God being in the form of a young man, beardless man. He has a narration that, God sits and crosses his legs. And he just narrates. It's not as if in his defense, the people would say, oh, this is just a narration with an isnad. He's not actually endorsing it. And the response is, okay, fair enough. But if you're going to have something as blasphemous as this, please, put a footnote or whatever. But the point is, that's Abu Ya'la. You have on the other side, Ibn Qudama, who is very much in line with a type of relegation of the meaning of the attributes. We don't even know what istiwa means. We don't even know what yad means, which is basically a version of Ash'arism, right? And you have Ibn Taymiyyah kind of in the middle. Ibn Taymiyyah comes along and basically demarcates a spectrum of pre-Ibn Taymiyyah intellectual thought and says, no, this is the only spectrum that's allowed. And he basically discards Ibn Qudama, discards Abu Ya'la, discards everybody else, Ibn al-Jawzi, just gets rid of them and says, no, this is the correct interpretation. Every Salafi post Ibn Taymiyyah, therefore, only looks at the divine attributes through the lens of Ibn Taymiyyah and discards other earlier connotations. An interesting anecdote here. It is quite clear that the early Hanabila, including Ahmad ibn Hanbal, assumed or believed that God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will place the Prophet Muhammad on the throne. This is a quite standard Hanbali belief. And Abu Dawood, the student of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, actually affirms this, and he says Ahmad ibn Hanbal also had this belief, that God shall sit him on the throne on the Day of Judgment next to him. And this is the Shafa'at al-Udma, or sorry, this is the Maqam al-Mahmud mentioned in the Quran, in the Hadith, Maqam al-Mahmud. Now Ibn Taymiyyah comes along and says, well, let's be clear here. Yes, there are some reports, but they're not authentic. And we really shouldn't, we shouldn't make this a part of our theology, right? He had to say this because pre-Ibn Taymiyyah, this was a defining characteristic of Hanbali theology. So much so, I'm getting into a lot of details, and I know the Salafis who are listening to this for the first time are going to be a bit shocked, but I'm not trying to give shock and awe. I'm being factual here. It is claimed that the great giant At-Tabari was beaten to death by angry mobs of the Hanbalis because of this issue. Go read the claims. Whether it's true or not, it's mentioned in the classical books when At-Tabari didn't quite, give respect to this notion. So there's a lot of statements that can be said over here in this regard. Clearly, Ibn Taymiyyah contributed. One final point. I know this can go on and on, but this is an area that I am quite passionate about and I love to talk about. So you asked me the wrong questions if you wanted a quick interview, sorry. But one of the key contributions to Ibn Taymiyyah, which is going to shape Wahhabism, Ibn Abdul Wahhab's theology, is the distinction between God's existence and lordship and between God's rights to be worshipped, uluhiyya, and the problematization of rituals that were becoming fairly mainstream in the time of Ibn Taymiyyah. So standing at long periods of time in front of the graves and believing the graves of the righteous exude barakah, and praying to Allah at the graves and traveling to visit the graves. This was becoming fairly normative in the time of Ibn Taymiyyah. And Ibn Taymiyyah was one of the first, if not the first, to not just say, guys, this is a bit fishy, but to say, guys, this is potentially shirk, if not outright shirk. So to lay, and again, for the record, I'm just being academic, I'm not taking sides here. To claim that these actions are potentially nullifying your Islam, that's a big claim. And Ibn Taymiyyah makes it. And Ibn Taymiyyah begins to problematize even traveling to visit the graves, which was the norm. Go read any Hanbali legal textbooks. Ibn Qudama, the icon of Hanbali Islam pre-Ibn Taymiyyah, mentions that the one going for Hajj should then go visit the grave of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina out of respect to him, or however the phrasing goes, but to go visit the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. This is Ibn Qudama saying this. Ibn Taymiyyah comes along a century and a half later and basically says to visit the grave of the Prophet ﷺ with the intention of visiting the grave is a bid'ah and a stepping stone to shirk, right? This is coming from Ibn Taymiyyah. And I haven't found anybody with this type of language and rhetoric pre-Ibn Taymiyyah. This is contributing to what is later going to become the thought of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, right? And again, this is a factually, correct statement. I understand the modern practitioners will find it problematic, but you will not find pre-Ibn Taymiyyah these notions problematized to that level. A, you will find statements that you shouldn't do this, and then B, the claim that this is kufr or shirk, because that's a big claim. The claim that a Muslim who understands La ilaha illallah doing some of these things is potentially negating La ilaha illallah, right? That is a claim that Ibn Taymiyyah made, but didn't really go the full 9 yards. But 5 centuries later, 4 centuries later, another figure will come from the deserts of Arabia by the name of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, who will then take the notions of Ibn Taymiyyah and then extrapolate them, which I think we're going to get to in a future question. But yeah, these are some of the contributions. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, and building on that, what do you say to scholars who argue that beyond his immediate students, the legacy of Ibn Taymiyyah was in fact largely constructed by 18th and 19th century reformers to serve their own agenda? One thing that your book demonstrates is that Taymiyyan thought really didn't die out after his immediate students, and actually persisted in the centuries following. I mean, I know a few other scholars or academics don't agree with that, but what do you say to that assertion?
The claim that Ibn Taymiyyah's thought fizzled out, disappeared, and then magically reappeared in Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's teachings, I don't agree with that claim. I understand why it's made, because no reformer pre-Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab attached himself to Ibn Taymiyyah to the level that Ibn Abdul Wahhab did. And so if you want to judge a follower of Ibn Taymiyyah as somebody who almost exclusively quotes him, I see where you're coming from. But what if you were to remove the notion of constantly quoting Ibn Taymiyyah? And what if you were to bring in, okay, what were there people who took the ideas and the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah and yes, mentioned him once in a while, but didn't quite view themselves as being under him? Rather, they're tapping into a sentiment and then they're expressing it in their own language and ideology. If you were to broaden influence, which I think that's the way you should broaden it, to encompass such trends, well then, you cannot deny and ignore that Ibn Taymiyyah continued to have impact across the Muslim globe. And there are key examples. Ibraheem al-Qurani is one of them. Shah Waliullah ad-Dehlavi. I mean, ad-Dehlavi writes an entire treatise that is completely coming from Ibn Taymiyyah. Ad-Dahlawi quotes Ibn Taymiyyah. Ad-Dahlawi's revivalist project owes a lot to Ibn Taymiyyah, right? And nobody can deny this. And Dahlawi himself mentions praise for Ibn Taymiyyah. So when you have one of the mujaddids of Indian subcontinent coming along and telling you, hey guys, Ibn Taymiyyah is a great guy, and writing books which are basically not copy and paste, but a contextualized, version, so Dahlawi's book, Hujjatullah al-Baligha, right? Anybody who reads it, you will see in it, he is echoing Ibn Taymiyyah's Raf' al-Alam. You will clearly see the two books coming from the same trajectory, the same, perspective. And other examples can be given as well. Muhammad Hayat al-Sindhi, who is actually the teacher of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Muhammad Hayat
the student of Al-Qurani.
What from the Qurani trend, yes. So Al-Qurani kind of sort of had multiple strands, like Rashid Rida. Later on, he has all these interesting strands, Muslim Brotherhood, and you got the progressive Muslims were also tapping into him. You got Al-Albani tapping into him. It's really interesting that Rashid Rida is also Ibn Taymiyyah's spark, right? Not through Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Rashid Rida bypasses the Wahhabis and he taps in directly to Ibn Abdul Wahhab. And then he's reintroduced to the Wahhabis and kind of sort of forms, a begrudging friendship with them. But Rashid Rida was not influenced firstly by Muhammad ibn Wahhab. He's one of the products directly of Taymiyyan thought here. So this claim that is made, and I'm well aware of the academics who make this claim, and I've read their papers, and I see where they're coming from, but it all goes back to definitions. It all goes back to how you want to view, being a follower of Ibn Taymiyyah. And I am not so restricted as to say, no, only Ibn Abdul Wahhab who really claimed to be. No, I see Ibn Taymiyyah as ripples spreading through, Islamic history after his time, and different people being impacted in different ways. In Ottoman Turkey, you had the Qadhi Zadele movement, which is Ash'ari Sufi, and yet without a doubt it's quoting Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim on aspects of grave worship. The term grave worship is Taymiyyan and Ibn Abdul Wahhab. When I say it, I'm automatically betraying I still have elements of that theology still left in me, because obviously we shouldn't call it grave worship because the people who are doing it are not worshipping, but their critics accuse them of grave worship, right? So again, that term is itself loaded. But venerating the graves, invoking the saints. The Qadhi Zadele movement is a purely Ottoman, Ash'ari, Sufi movement that has taken these aspects straight from Ibn al-Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah. And they're quoting Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah. And they're in Ottoman lands. So the claim that Ibn Taymiyyah was neglected, ignored, bypassed until Ibn Abdul Wahhab came, I'm sorry, that is it's just a false claim, number one. Number two, the claim that modern Salafis have reconstructed his image, I actually agree with this, but I disagree with the person and the methodology and the idea of saying this. I would say every single classical scholar who is put on a pedestal by modern movements, they're doing the exact same thing to their icon. I would say traditionalist Islam is reinventing Ghazali. I would say this. The same way modern Salafis are reinventing Ibn Taymiyyah. That's a product of fundamentalist movements where they go back and they romanticize certain figures and icons. So the Salafis are no more or no less guilty than any other movement in this regard. So I would say, yes, they're doing this, but who hasn't? In fact, what movement doesn't do it? The modern American, followers, the 4th of July just happened, and you hear about the founding fathers and whatnot, the way they aggrandize and romanticize the founding fathers. Such is human nature. So to pretend that only Salafis are doing it, and this is my small defense of them, right? Because again, I'm not a critic, I'm not just a complete follower, but I'm an academic. You want to accuse the Salafis of doing something, everybody else is just as guilty of the exact same thing, romanticizing specific figures, selectively choosing, reinterpreting, and presuming that they are authentically following. You cannot authentically follow somebody in the 10th century when you're living in the 20th century. You can't do that. You must selectively pick and choose and reinterpret. Every movement does this. So the modern Salafis are no more guilty than any other strand in this regard.
in terms of addressing sort of misreadings of his work or his reception history, what do previous academic treatments of Ibn Taymiyyah, particularly in Western academia, I'm thinking of academics like John Hoover, get wrong about him and his work, in your view?
Oh, actually, John Hoover, I would say, is the dawn of Ibn Taymiyyah studies. So I have read almost everything that he's written, and I don't have anything to disagree with, honestly. John Hoover. So if you wanted to look at writings, 50 years ago, three decades ago, without a doubt, there was a lot of superficial stuff about Ibn Taymiyyah. The crass stereotype of him being a literal fundamentalist who doesn't understand falsafa and kalam. That type of simplistic analysis, I believe, it's no longer in the academy. People do understand Ibn Taymiyyah to be a brilliant mind who might not have agreed with falsafa, but without a doubt, he understood falsafa, who might not have agreed with aspects of whatever. But so I would say that Ibn Taymiyyah studies in the modern academy have actually jumped leaps and bounds in the last few decades. I read a book recently, Abdul Rahman Mustafa's book about the attributes of God. I forgot the title of it, but very, very well-written book about Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding of the attributes of God. Hardly anything like this, maybe even in Arabic, the way that he's analyzed this. So yes, I would actually say John Hoover and others are doing an amazing work, and I don't have much to disagree with what I've read so far from them.
Okay. So you've already touched on this slightly in terms of how Ibn Taymiyyah sort of influenced Wahhabism and its legacy. You present two contrasting summaries of the life of Ibn Abdul Wahhab in your book. One is sympathetic and is sort of titled The Reviver of the Prophetic Message, and the other is more adversarial and is titled The Fanatical Deviant. Why did you believe it was important to juxtapose these two narratives?
I am so happy that you asked me this question. This is not scripted, by the way. I didn't ask you to ask this question. I'm so happy you asked it, because this is I haven't said this, but this is the first time it will be said here. When I was writing this book, I was really in a dilemma about how to write about Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Because how do you describe somebody who is viewed to be a mujaddid and a reformer by large groups of the people, who at the same time is also viewed to be a khariji, fanatical deviant by others? How do you neutrally clarify and explain? And this is one of the most difficult aspects of the book for me when I got to this chapter of writing his biography. And I was wondering, how do I present a biography that caters to both audiences? Because this is an academic book. And then just a light bulb moment, one day I was just like, one of my problems, I have a sleep problem, by the way. I toss and turn at night thinking about the most obscure issues. I just can't go to sleep. My brain is shouting things at me. So one evening I'm tossing and turning. I'm trying to figure this out. And all of a sudden the light bulb came off. Like, whoa, excellent. Let's write two biographies. And let's explain and clarify why I'm doing this. And that will solve and also contrast. So those who love Ibn Abdul Wahhab, they're going to see him in my version A, right? And they're going to be happy that, okay, I presented the facts, right? And those who view him in a different way, they'll see him in version B. And then both version A followers and version B followers will be able to contrast, which is exactly what neutral academics is about, to be able to empathize and see different perspectives. And so that's exactly what I did, that I ended up writing two biographies. Both of them are factual. Both of them are taking straight from the original sources. Both of them are taking snippets as portrayed and understood by adherents to both paradigms. And the goal is to contrast and to show the followers of both strands that the perception they have of this person is not the perception the other group has, and to explain why that is the case. So thank you for asking that question, because I now explain in more detail how and why that happened.
Well, there's in terms of moving on about his theological legacy, there's long been a debate about whether he considered the majority of Muslims in his time to be pagans and whether he legitimized violence against them on that basis. Why do scholars come to such different conclusions on that issue? And more broadly, how much of his thought was inspired by earlier figures like Ibn Taymiyyah and the Hanbali tradition? Like,
Hmm.
how much of can you find in his work from those earlier scholars?
So that's a two-part question.
Yeah.
Firstly, you said there has long been a debate.
Mm-hmm.
Factually speaking, no, there hasn't. This debate is only 20, 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the most contentious issues where, Tehran, you asked me how modern Wahhabis or Salafis would critique the book. Without a doubt, this is going to be, and I think so, one of the harshest aspects of criticism. They're going to say, I have misunderstood Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and Ibn Abdul Wahhab was not a takfiri. To which I say, Alhamdulillah, thank God. We don't want the modern subscribers of the movement to actually follow the founder of the movement. And we thank God, I say genuinely, as a practicing believing Muslim, Alhamdulillah, the modern movement, by and large, has distanced itself from the original teachings to the point of quite literally defending a distorted version and claiming that those who are preaching the real version or those who are describing the real version are deviant and wrong. I would much rather the modern followers of Abdul Wahhab consider me to be a mubtadi' than to follow the teachings of Ibn Abdul Wahhab originally. I say this bluntly. So the reason why, and the book clarifies, and with humility, I'm not trying to be, it proves it definitively. I'm sorry, but this is one of my pet peeves of the movement, so I did go into a lot of detail. So to the critics who don't believe this, read chapter 3 of the book, and especially I have entire sections dedicated to proving this. Here's the key point here. No biographer, chronicler, historian, or critic of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab up until the movement, up until 1930 or 40, no writer who described the movement described it except as it being a takfiri jihadist movement. Not a single person. This was the one unifying characteristic about the movement from non-Muslims, from travelers, Doherty, the British guy, or was a French guy wandering through the desert and hearing about the Wahhabis and what he's writing as an outsider and internal, and the Ottoman Mufti, Ibn Abidin, the Mufti of the Ottomans, the Imams of the Haram at the time that are writing, the scholars of Medina and Hijaz, the scholars of Kufa, everybody around the globe who is describing the movement from whatever strand, even fellow Hanbali Ibn Taymiyyah inspired revivers like a Shawkani, right? And like Ibn al-San'ani. Al-Shawkani and al-San'ani are tapping into Ibn Taymiyyah's legacy. And yet they are claiming this movement, this guy is making takfir of everybody else. And he's fighting everybody else. His own brother, his older brother, refutes him, Sulaiman. And he says to him, even if you think this is wrong, you don't have to claim everybody's a kafir, right? That's literally in his book. Okay, it might be wrong. I agree with you. Some of these things are not right. Venerating the grave and doing these types of stuff. And I also say this is not right. I personally, as a Muslim, I don't like this type of stuff. But to say that somebody who does it has rejected the kalima, and then you can fight him, and then you can kill him, this his own brother said. So the only time where people are saying, no, he didn't do this, is basically the last 30 years. How did that happen? And I myself was a person who was spreading that same notion that no, he wasn't a takfiri, he wasn't somebody who fought against Muslims. How did this happen? How did this flip happen? How did this 180 come about? This is what I talk about in my book, and I've described it as the 3 waves of Ibn Abdul Wahhab thought. The first wave lasts from his time up until 1927, the founding of the kingdom. 200 years, 150 years to be more precise, 150 years of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's thought, him, his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, the Mufti of the second state, all of them are crystal clear. Everybody outside of our movement is not a believer, and we have the right to fight them. In fact, Ibn Abdul Wahhab's grandson, Sulaiman, and the main mufti of the second state and the first and the second state, all of them, people like Abdullah Aba Butain and others, they have treatises that you can read about, forget the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, and when we see the Ottoman Empire, by the way, this is the bulk of the Ummah, this is everybody, this is the Sultan, this is the Khalifa. Forget the Ottoman Empire. It is understood the Ottoman Empire is pagan. These treatises that are written, Suleiman wrote a treatise, Aba Butain wrote a treatise, Hamad ibn Atiq wrote a treatise, like all of these scholars from 1810 to 1850 to 1900, right? Around this type of 80, 90 years. You have multiple treatises. The thesis of it is the same. What is that thesis? These Bedouin tribes who agreed to ally with the Ottomans against us, these tribes who have politically given their loyalties to the Ottoman forces against us, there is no doubt that they are pagan, they are mushrik, they're outside the fold of Islam. Why? Because they have allied themselves with a pagan dynasty. And that pagan dynasty is not the British, it's not the Orientalists, it's not the French, it is the Ottoman Sultan and the empire. And this was unanimously agreed amongst this movement up until the second wave comes, which is represented by the Grand Mufti Muhammad ibn Ibraheem, who was appointed the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti title comes later, but in effect, he is the Grand Mufti by King Abdul Aziz, where he begins to soften, because now that you have a kingdom, now that you have a country in the modern world, you cannot claim we have to do jihad against everybody else. So this individual, this personality, the teacher of Shaykh bin Baz, he basically says the same as wave one, but acts differently than wave one. This is wave two. Nothing changes in theory, but in action, everything changes. And you needed wave two to get to wave three. Wave two has cognitive dissonance. Wave two is clear contradiction, but you need to do it to get to wave three. So for around 30, 40 years, what Muhammad ibn Ibrahim does, all of his fatawa are basically wave one. There's no difference. He literally calls Egypt to be a pagan or a kafir land. He calls all the countries around. He goes, in effect, they are Jahili countries. They're not really, Muslim countries. Yet, he hosts the muftis and the scholars of these countries. Ironically, the mufti of Turkey at the time comes and visits, right? Ironically, the ancestors of the mufti of Turkey and the mufti of Saudi Arabia would have literally been physically fighting one another, right? The biological, not the biological, the intellectual ancestors, right? Within a generation, he now says, look, in effect, he says, I'll call you a kafir, but I'll treat you like a Muslim. I'm being a bit simplistic, but that's basically second wave, right? Theoretically, your beliefs, your actions are outside the fold, but realistically, we can't do this. So we'll just pretend and we'll just treat you like Muslims. That was second wave. But you need to figure out intellectually how to solve this contradiction. This is third wave. And third wave begins in the late 60s, 70s, particularly in the late 70s, early 80s. And of course, this is the wave that I was swept in. This is the wave that I studied when I was in Medina. This is the wave that became the global wave because of institutes like my alma mater and others that basically allowed this ideology to become mainstream. And what is third wave Wahhabism? Third wave is to intellectually solve the problem of the second wave and even the first wave. How do you reconcile the claim that the bulk of the Muslim world is guilty of shirk, but they're not mushrik? How do you reconcile? You bring about You extrapolate from a well-known Sunni principle. The principle is not new. Wahhabis didn't discover it. And that is al-udhru bil-jahl. Ignorance is an excuse. Now, this principle was rarely invoked pre-Wahhabi. You find it in tertiary books of fiqh, primarily for new converts who say bizarre things that everybody should know is wrong. So, As-Suyuti says, if somebody says that drinking khamr is halal, I mean, this is clear kufr, unless he's somebody living far away from the lands of Islam. He's a new convert, he doesn't know any better, so we excuse him for ignorance, right? So the notion of excuse for ignorance is there when somebody might say a bizarre statement. Ibn Abdul Wahhab himself mentions this very infrequently, but he doesn't apply it in his life. In his life, he will do jihad against you. Third wave finds those infrequent quotations and extrapolates an alternative image to the original. That alternative image, romanticized, sanitized, imaginary, is that Ibn Abdul Wahhab, as a default, excused people for ignorance and did not make takfir of people, much less fight them. Now, in order to make this claim, you cannot actually read the writings of Ibn Abdul Wahhab directly, and you cannot read the history of the movement directly. You must read them through the lens of third wave, which is what I did when I was at that phase. You must be spoon-fed snippets, and the history of the movement must be sanitized. When you go to the original, when you go to the works written by the own followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, you find there was always jihad against fellow Muslims. They called it jihad, they called it ghazawat. There was always the claim that these fellow Muslims are non-Muslims. And here's the irony of ironies. The first generations of the movement, the students of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and his students, Abdullah Abu Butain, for example, and he's like of the founders of the second dynasty, the scholar of the second dynasty. He had to explain away the same phrases that were used by the third wave to justify al-udhr bil-jahl. He had to say, no, guys, no. He was being accused like, hey, how come Ibn Abdul Wahhab has these phrases of excusing from ignorance? How can he have these phrases? And he had to say, actually, you have to understand these phrases were at the very beginning of his preaching when the people didn't know any better. As soon as his preaching became the norm, and as soon as he had a state, Abu Butain says, he did not excuse for ignorance, and he considered everybody who didn't follow that version of Islam to be pagan. Because here's the point, and I have said this even on Twitter and online. How can you excuse the Grand Mufti of Morocco and Syria and Egypt and Pakistan of ignorance? How can you say their beliefs are shirk, but will excuse them for ignorant? Do you not see how ridiculous that is? Right. You can excuse a brand new Muslim. Yes, he doesn't know any better. You can excuse somebody that has never heard of Islam and he says a preposterous claim. How can you excuse the Grand Muftis of all the countries outside of your own when they say that istighatha bil amwat is not shirk? What ignorance are you talking about? Like, how is this ignorant? And so it doesn't even make sense to say excuse from ignorance. So my point is that, anyway, to answer your question, the third wave attempted to portray Ibn Abdul Wahhab as being a more reasonable reformer. And in that, they had to reconstruct an image. And that image is Ibn Abdul Wahhab never fought anybody, which is of course patently false, unless they fought him. He never made takfir unless iqamat al-hujjah and back and forth, which is of course patently false. He sent assassins to kill Ibn Muhammad in his masjid. He legitimized warfare against tribes that remained neutral. This is well known. There were tribes, the tribe of Zulfi, for example, that said, look, we don't want to get involved in the civil war. We're neither pro-Ottoman, nor are we elsewhere. We just want to be neutral. And he gave a fatwa that their shirk is not in doubt because they remain neutral in a matter of tawheed and shirk and kufr, and whoever remains neutral himself becomes a kafir. This is his own fatwa in his own lifetime. So bottom line, I'm actually happy that the modern followers take their anger out on me and others and they say we're wrong. I'd rather they say that than go and rediscover the original. But for the academics amongst them, for those that are seeking the truth, do understand that all the people outside of the movement describe the movement as being inherently takfiri prone and inherently violent. And final point for this question, I can go on and on. The modern jihadist movements, in particular ISIS, have tapped into first wave Wahhabism quite authentically. And they're quoting the texts written pre-1925, the first generation, second generation of texts. And they themselves are saying, hey, you guys of the third wave, they don't say third wave, but hey, you modern followers, you have betrayed the principles of our own founding fathers. And This for me was a punch in the gut back in 2008 and 9 and 10, because deep down inside, even though at the time I was still an admirer, deep down inside, I knew they were right and I couldn't explain it away. For me, this was one of the catalysts where I really had to make a stand, because deep down inside, having read the works, having known, you know, on a personal level, it's very common for people to live in cognitive dissonance or in denial for many things, right? It's human nature, whatever it might be, whether it's a difficult issue of life, whether it's a trauma, tragedy, whether it's a personal experience, you just live in denial, right? I was living in that type of denial for almost a decade, where deep down inside, I know something is wrong, but everything else is good and fine, and I have a group and I have a fellowship and I have people to teach and whatnot, and so things are going fine. For me, a number of factors forced me to take a stand. Either I could pretend to preach a version that I did not believe in, which to me would be the height of hypocrisy, and I'd have to answer to Allah, because if I'm preaching sincerely, at least I'm excused in that regard, that I can say, oh Allah, I thought this was true. But if I'm preaching knowing it's wrong, to me that is a very, very dangerous thing. And I can honestly state, and I hope I remain this way to that till I die, everything I preach of Islam, I believe it to be true. Otherwise I would not preach it, because I'm not representing myself here when I preach. When I teach and I have to present other views, that's a different thing. So one of the causes for me to move on from the movement was the punch in the gut, the realization that ISIS is actually representing Ibn Abdul Wahhab better than his own biological descendants of the third wave, if that makes sense. And I could not follow a religion like that. I just could. ISIS is not the religion of the Prophet. It's not. So anyway, I can go on and on, but one speech leads to another.
No, that was great. And yeah, that was great. We're now witnessing a fourth wave of Wahhabism with MBS, modernizing reforms. Or is this actually the unraveling of the movement altogether? What does this mean for the long-term legacy of Wahhabism, both within Saudi Arabia and beyond?
So the unraveling, that's a loaded term. Do you think that third wave unraveled the movement or gave it impetus? Depends on your perspective, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah, I guess I would have said impetus, gave it impetus.
Well then, I have a phrase here in my book at the conclusion of chapter 3. First wave Wahhabism would have to dissociate itself from third wave Wahhabism in matters of creed and theology, to the point of first wave considering third wave to be outside the fold of Islam. And I will defend that statement academically. The founder would have considered his own biological descendants, who are now the ministers and the grand and whatnot. The founder, if he were fair to his own principles, would have had to consider his own heirs, biological and intellectual, to literally be outside the fold of Islam. So it all goes back to definitions then, and how do you want to consider revival or whatnot? Will the movement cease to exist? No, that's the whole point. My book demonstrates that all movements traverse through this trajectory of their socio-political context, and in order to survive, they have to adapt. Salafism is not unique in this regard. Every movement, Deobandism started off as an anti-colonialist jihadist project against the British. Now they're the most tame, pacifist Tablighi Jamaats you can imagine, right? All movements evolve. Traditionalism, I can critique them as well. Look at how they evolved. Look at where they became now. Every movement, you have to. Ibadis came from one place, and look where they are now. And I can say a lot about the Ibadis. I think they're greatly misrepresented by their critics, right? There's a lot of positives to say about them, right? My point is that every movement has to evolve. There's no such thing as this unblemished diamond that the Salafis imagine that is being handed from generation to generation. So when you say that will the fourth wave destroy the movement, the response is obviously not. It's simply going to change and adapt as all the previous waves have done. Now, will it make it unrecognizable to practitioners of the third wave? I believe in some ways, yes, but the same is said of the first to the third. I believe in some ways, yes, it will. It will make it unrecognizable. But just like first wave lives on in small pockets, so too third wave will live on in larger pockets. We see this in America and England to this day, where in spite of the changes taking place in the mothership, the mother base, in spite of the changes taking place by the official decrees and the scholars of the, the two holy mosques and everything, all of those changes is kind of sort of post fourth wave. Still, because of the impact and legacy of third wave, which is greater than first and second, the impact and legacy of third wave is more global, and it has had the largest base for reasons I mentioned in my book. That impact shall remain even if the mother base and the mothership moves on. And that impact will then have to deal with its own context and changes. So we find a revivalism of third wave Wahhabism in America and England and other countries as well. They've disconnected from the mothership now, whereas in the 90s, these strands were directly connected to the mothership. They've disconnected officially, and in pockets, in Birmingham, in California, in places, New Jersey, other places, you have these pockets of people. But I will say, and I'm not trying to be harsh here, I'm just speaking factually, and I could be wrong. I will say, I think third wave Salafism has seen its heyday in the 90s. And I think that it will never come back to the quantity, much less the quality that it had for multiple reasons. Of them is the phenomena of post-Salafism, which I know you want to talk about as well. And of them is the fact that the support that used to exist for third wave no longer exists. That support financially, politically, it no longer exists. And you need that support. There's no sinister agenda or motive. Movements need support. When a movement is not supported, how will it sustain itself? It becomes more difficult. So I don't think third wave Salafism, Wahhabism will disappear. It shall always remain in pockets, but it will become increasingly isolated, and in the process more and more cultish. Salafism is always one of the things, my criticism, it has always been a bit cultish, but now it's going to become even more so. But like all such ideologies, you will have, Tehran, I'm sure you're familiar with the trajectory of American Islam, the Nation of Islam and whatnot. We still have the Moorish Science Temple around. We still have, 50 people that are still a part of that. I was shocked to discover this a few years ago. They're still around. So if they're still around, you don't think a movement that spawned millions of preachers and teachers, that had tens of thousands of institutes in the 90s and 2000s, that's going to remain? Of course it's going to remain. Right. I only hope that they tone down attacking fellow Muslims and start benefiting, because the Salafi movement has a lot of positives. And if they restrict themselves to those positives, they can actually benefit a lot more people.
And I really do hope that we get to those positives during this discussion. But one thing I wanted to mention, and you kind of tapped on it in terms of backing, how true is the common narrative that the rise of popularity of Salafism, especially in the English-speaking world, was the result of Saudi petrodollars? How would...
Yes and no. Yes and no. I understand the question.
Okay.
And it always would hurt me because I went through the movement. I believed in the movement. I still have soft spots for the movement. Nobody handed me a wad of cash and said, hey, Yasir, convert. No Saudi petrodollar, no oil barrel was given to me as a gift for embracing Ibn Taymiyyah and Wahhabism. Come on, so the notion that Saudi petrodollars finance the movement, there's an element of caricaturization and stereotyping that really just borders on the crass, a calumny against the movement. Listen, the movement appeals to people intellectually. There's a mass appeal for reasons that everybody should acknowledge, and the book mentions explicitly. It's simplistic slogans. It's call to worship Allah alone. It's giving primacy to the persona of the Prophet ﷺ. These are slogans that frankly, no Muslim would disagree with. Of course, the devil's in the details of how you interpret them, but the concept, no Muslim would disagree with. So Salafism appeals intellectually. Now, where does money come into play? money comes into play as it comes into play with anything, and that is supporting the infrastructures that are making these claims, giving media attention, publishing books, producing graduates of Islamic universities. So while it is true, nobody handed me a wad of cash, it is also true that I had a scholarship to go study at the most prestigious university for free. They paid me a very small stipend, $150 a month, which for me, because of my spoiled lifestyle of the West, was definitely not enough. But let's be honest here. For most of the students, it's enough to live off of that. Free housing, for me, it wasn't good enough. I have to rent outside. Again, because I'm spoiled and going from America, that's on me. For the rest of the world, free housing, free room and board, and $100 a month, $150 a month, that is being financed. Now, is that an incentive for somebody to come and study? Of course not. It's very difficult living conditions. It's harsh, and it's years of rigorous study. Why would anybody go and study for 5-10 years because of what, $100 a month? But does it facilitate studying? Of course it does. So there is an element of, and of course, the fact that there's a country that's, behind it, it's like it's soft power. And this is just the way politics works. So to answer your question, I don't view this as some sinister agenda. Everybody does it. Does not America exude its soft power via its own media, its own entertainment, its own politicians? Does not every single group in the world, and I say this, you hear me kind of defending, because this is not a criticism that is fair to make against only Salafis.
Right.
This is a criticism that is universal to all movements. What if somebody were to point out that other strands of Islam are being financed by other regimes? And I don't want to be too explicit right now, but what if somebody were to point that out? And that's factually correct, right? It is what it is. Every group, every politician, every power base wants to help what it believes to be authentic. In fact, in my library chats, I went even further and I said politely, the reason why Ash'arism is the dominant strand is because Nizam al-Mulk single-handedly engineered an institution, the Nizamiyya, that brought about what if somebody were to say, and the early Hanabila said this, Ibn al-Jawzi says this, that the reason why the Ash'aris are dominant is because of Nizam al-Mulk, his money, his power, his status. That accusation is there. The irony, by the way, the Salafis made it against the Ash'aris 700 years ago. Now it's the other way around here. Right. So bottom line, the claim is a caricature of a kernel of truth that all movements should be guilty of. That's my answer.
And I was surprised to find in your book, as in the case for Salafism in the UK, a lot of it was funded organically by people here in the UK, not from anywhere outside. I was actually very surprised to find that, because that's not some, especially here in the UK, that's one of the allegations that a lot of Salafi masjids get.
Not at all.
They're funded.
I was active in the movement since I was a teenager, 1990, 91. I joined the movement. I was a part of the Quran Sunnah Society. I met so many of the students of Al-Albani when they would come. I met the icons of the movement, and they all wrote me personal letters of tazkiyah to go to Medina. All of them, they knew me back in the day. And they're still in touch with me, those that are alive, although they don't talk to me anymore, but yeah, they're still in touch with me. I can attest to the fact that there was a lot of genuine sacrifice and camaraderie. Heck, I, as a teenager, barely earning any money, in order to help the da'wah salafiyya, I would purchase hundreds of dollars of worth of books. I'm quoting my book here, but Salafi books, the Prophet's prayer described, right? Muhsin Khan's translation of the Quran, Sahih Bukhari. As a teenager, I purchased and brought them to my house, my bedroom, and I would go to the masjid and sell them for cost, not even for any, I wouldn't get any money for this, because I believed in the cause, right? Salafism really gave life to a new generation of second generation born and raised Muslims who didn't find the Islam of the cultural Islam of their parents to be relevant. Salafism was a spark, an exciting spark. I remember as a teenager, it was authentic, looked to be. It gave this academic veneer that wasn't found in the dull, boring, cultural, tame version of Islam of my parents, right? And so you find meaning and purpose, and you are willing to sacrifice. I sacrificed time, effort, and money as a teenager, and I gave up my career as a chemical engineer. I had to offer a Dow Chemical. Everybody knows that it's in my biographies. I gave up Dow Chemical to go study in Medina, not because Saudi Arabia gave me money, because I believed in the cause, and it was something that inspired me. So I don't view it in this simplistic manner. I say that the positives of Salafism need to be understood, and the impact that it causes on people and it caused on people needs to be understood. And to dismiss it in this manner, oh, Saudi funded. No, I'm sorry, that is not the case.
Just in terms of sort of false characterizations or previous narratives that you're trying to correct in your book, you are quite critical of previous academic attempts to offer a typology of the Salafi movement while presenting one of your own in the introduction. How does your typology fix the problems found in those that precede your book?
So this is a difficult question to answer in a few minutes. One of the problems of past typologies, there's multiple problems. Firstly, anytime you want to categorize, you're automatically giving your own biases rather than the biases of the objects you're categorizing, right? So if you enter a room with lots of people, do you want to categorize them based upon gender? Do you want to categorize them based upon height, based upon skin color, based upon ethnicity, based upon profession? The minute you do so, the room is the room. You say more about yourself than you do about the room when you categorize. Of course, Edward Said points this out in Orientalism in a much more profound manner. In constructing the other, you betray your own identity. So one of the problems of previous categorizations is that they're approaching Salafism from their own lens. And especially after 9/11, that lens was completely political and jihadi. And to me, political and jihadi manifestations of Salafism are trends that you find in all movements, not just Salafism. You will find Sufi jihadis, you will find Sufi pacifists, you'll find Sufi politicos, and you'll find Sufi quietists, right? So this notion that what is characteristic about Salafis is how they view politics, how they view the ruler, how they view jihad. The same you can copy and paste and move on to Ash'arism or other trends as well. This is one of the things that irritated me. Another thing is that it's not organic enough, because there are variables that might be unique to one culture and not to another. So what I proposed was an organic multivariable. And therefore, I present a typology. It's too complicated to explain in 2 minutes. Basically, I present a model. That model, any researcher can take that model and create a new one for their particular book in 2 minutes. Based on my model, it's like a tool that will allow them to extrapolate what they want to emphasize in categorizing Salafis, right? So it's organic and fluid. The term fluid is popular these days. It's multivariable. Multivariable, you can pick and choose what you want to highlight, and you will admit to your audience, this is my bias. And I'm using this because I want to categorize Salafis based upon this particular variable. So this is why I believe that what I proposed, it's a more of a 3D than a stagnant 2D, if that makes sense. It allows for some fine-tuning and can be copied and pasted and then utilized for your specific purpose, and nobody can accuse you of bias because you know where it's coming from.
Addressing the most controversial strand of Salafism that you spend a lot of time on in your book, what does most of the political and academic analysis of jihadi Salafism, particularly that conducted by Western institutions, ignore about the causes of the movement in your view? And how effective do you think the response has been, both from Muslim scholars and maybe non-Muslim institutions, have been in challenging and refuting the theological interpretations that underpin that movement?
Excellent question. What have been the few main things that academics have ignored about jihadi Salafism? 2 points. Number one, jihadi Salafism is always a fringe of mainstream Salafism, and it always has been pre-Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Ibn Abdul Wahhab definitely created a jihadist streak, but then the third wave eliminated the jihadist streak. That was what the second and third wave did, right? And so the way Salafism existed, in the year 2000 was by and large non-jihadist, academic. And so jihadi Salafism is an aberration for its time and place to the mainstream Salafism of its time and place. Most academics ignored this, and they simplistically, the 9/11 Commission report from the United States Senate and government literally lists Ibn Taymiyyah and Bin Laden in the first paragraph of its book. They list Ibn Taymiyyah and Bin Laden. So to simplistically claim, and when I was first preaching and teaching, when I first came back from Medina, the term Salafi in the modern discourse was synonymous to jihadi and al-Qaeda. The term Salafi was synonymous to jihad and al-Qaeda. And that is why I had a severe pushback from many segments when I tried to claim that I'm pacifist Salafi, for example. I would claim this publicly in 2004 and 5 and 6 like that. I would say this publicly, I'm a pacifist Salafi. What do you mean a pacifist? There's no such thing. How is there a pacifist Salafi? So this is, I think, one of the biggest misunderstandings, right? Another misunderstanding, and this is without a doubt the number one with all books written about jihadi movements, all jihadi movements, the obsession with understanding jihadi movements solely from the lens of religion and Islam and fiqh and Quran, minus the political reality and the very real social grievances that the jihadists have, that has actually caused the movement to be formed. Jihadi movements have much more to do with the politics of the world and with post-colonization and with the effects of the Cold War than they have to do with Ibn Taymiyyah. And hardly any academic is brave enough to acknowledge that. You need Ibn Taymiyyah to construct a response, but the catalyst for the reason for constructing the response is not Ibn Taymiyyah. It is the grievances that jihadi movements have against the realities taking place. So I think these are some of the biggest misunderstandings. What was your other question about this, the jihadi movements?
In terms of how effective do you think Muslim scholars have been in challenging and refuting the theological interpretations that underpin the jihadi movement?
So I believe this still requires a little bit of effort. And one of the reasons being, now we've gone through 3-4 phases, right? So I've been preaching for the last 30 years in the Western world, 27 years. I came back 2004, right? So 22 years, yeah. And since I have come back, we have seen the rise and the fall of Al-Qaeda, the rise and the fall of ISIS, and now the issue of Palestine and Gaza. And in all of these cases, the rhetoric of jihad in some of the segments of the ummah has been there. Until you solve the problem of the displaced people and the people that are being bombed and the people that are being slaughtered, how can you expect me to tap down or to placate legitimate anger and grievances? The problem is not coming from me or books of fiqh. The problem is coming from how you've treated 1 million Iraqis, how you've treated the entirety of Afghanistan, and now how you're treating 1.7 million Palestinians. How can I, as a theologian, be expected? What do you want me to do? You're the ones bombing. You're the ones, invading. You're the ones throwing carpet bombs on Afghanistan and destabilizing Iraq and Syria. So unless and until socio-political solutions are given to the peoples, there's only so much we can do at the intellectual side. We can try to explain to them, this is not the most effective, this is not the best mechanism. But what do you say to a group of people that are starving to death because they're literally being surrounded by an occupying force? Do they not have the right to fight back? I'm sorry to be blunt here, but let's be real here. What would you do? What would anybody else do? What would any group of people do? So that's exactly why I have never, and even back then, and it was really difficult. You can read the New York Times article. Even back then, I never criticized the people of Afghanistan for what they did, and the people of Iraq for what they did, and the people of Gaza for what they did. I'm not in a position to do so. It's not my right. I have never once criticized what, and I have said even in public in early 2000s, what would you do if your country was invaded by a foreign nation, a foreign force, a foreign occupying power? What would you do? Who would be the patriot and who would be the tyrant and who would be the betrayer? I've actually said this in public multiple times without being too explicit, but you have to cause them to think here. Right. So I am not somebody who's going to pretend that no, our religion is a pacifist religion, we turn the other cheek. No, not at all. We're going to defend, and whoever has the right to defend should do so. But I'm an American citizen, and I have to ask myself, what is the best usage of my time and resources, and how will the Ummah benefit the most? And what is allowed for me as a Muslim carrying a citizenship? These are questions I've been very clear about. For the Western Muslims, they should not get involved in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan without a doubt. I've said this from day one. You're going to cause issues and problems, and you're going to cause, and is it a legitimate, if you jump in between Muslims fighting, which was what was happening in Syria, I'm talking about 10 years ago, right? You're jumping in between Muslims fighting there. So it's easier to talk about these realities once we can acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is the primary cause is not fiqh and Salafism and jihad and no, the primary cause is the destabilization of these countries that our own countries have done. Once we can talk about that, then we can move to the tertiary issues and deal with it more effectively. Otherwise, we will always be impaired in offering real analyses. And if you read the New York Times article, it's 15, 16 years old now, you can Google it, why Yasir Qadhi wants to talk about jihad. That's the title of the article in the New York Times, 10,000 words, cover story magazine. Why Yasir Qadhi wants to talk about jihad. Why? Because I wasn't allowed to talk about the real issues. I can't. I need to explain. The only way I can legitimately at the time tell my American Muslim, students, guys, you shouldn't be doing this, is if I can say, but what they can be doing is considered a legitimate jihad in Afghanistan. I couldn't say it, because if I were, I'd be sitting in Guantanamo, because they would say I'm supporting the truth, whatever, supporting the invasion of the troops, whatever it might be. So unless and until we acknowledge the elephants in the room, we can only do so much about the notion of de-radicalization, because is it really radical to fight for your rights? That's the question we need to ask ourselves.
I think given the situation in Palestine at the moment and the fact that it's been a constant rallying call for jihadi Salafism, I think we're all anticipating what the events of the last 2 years how it might impact the spread of such groups and the radicalization of young Muslims, and how difficult that is to address.
Yeah, so obviously, I'm very happy seeing the mobilization that is happening across the world for Gaza, and the fact that the next generation is inspired to do something. And I'm also happy, by and large, that we're not seeing violence, because that was not the case 2004, 5, 6, 2010. And you're speaking from England. Thousands of British youth, if I'm not mistaken, joined. In America, we had around 700, 800, we joined, and I'm against that. And I'm against it because, as I explained, it's going to cause more harm than damage, and it's not your battle to fight, and you're being used as a pawn because of your citizenship. You should not get involved. When it comes to Palestine, because of the geopolitical realities of that region, because no entity has allowed for people to defend physically, so we're not hearing that rhetoric. Rather, what we are hearing is political activism. What we are hearing is bringing aid to the people. And I think this is a very positive thing that, alhamdulillah, it has caused us to think and mature and whatnot. But at the same time, even as I say, individually in the Western world, obviously, we are not and should not be thinking of physical help. I have to say, isn't it a shame that as a global ummah, no country has offered physical help? That is something we have to acknowledge as well as a failure at the global level.
Okay, so moving on to Post-Salafism. This is a chapter of your book that Roxana thought that I would like, and I actually found it very insightful. In your final chapter, you discuss the phenomenon of post-Salafism, a term that is still unfamiliar to some. Can you define what post-Salafism is for our audience and which institutions and scholars
So
you consider to be
there's
prominent pioneers?
no there's no academic definition of post-Salafism, but in my book, I use a definition that some academics have tried to do. It's a very ambiguous definition. Post-Salafism refers to an emerging amorphous category of Muslim scholars who seem to find Salafi theology and activism too narrow when it comes to confronting complex social and political arenas, right? That's a very vague definition. And because it is a new phenomenon, it's going to take a while for a more concrete definition to come. And we're still seeing it in live reality. I'm a product of post-Salafism. I have been defined by academic papers. There's like 4 papers written about me and a PhD at a university. I didn't know about this. I found out there's a PhD about me as well. So I have been described as a post-Salafi, and that's factually correct. Lots of other institutes, lots of other thinkers. In Arabia, Salman al-Auda has been described as being a post-Salafi. Hatim al-Auni is being described as being post-Salafi. Across the world, so many thinkers are basically, and what combines them are a number of things. First and foremost, all of them had some type of association within the movement. Secondly, they seem to have found the movement lacking in addressing the issues of the time. It's not doing its job to benefit the ummah directly. It seems a bit antiquated, a bit fundamentalist, thinking backwards, out of touch with reality. In my case, I will say frankly, obsessing over arcane issues of theology that are of little to no relevance to the modern world. But see, that accusation also applies to Sufis and Ash'aris and Maturidis as well. It's not just Salafis. To remain in this cultish bubble and to resurrect bygone controversies when the ummah is literally dying in Gaza, when we're fractured into 50 countries, when we have a high rate of ridda in our communities, and the preachers and teachers are still arguing over what does it mean istawa ala al-arsh, then honestly, anybody who does this publicly on Twitter, on YouTube, back and forth, honestly has lost the plot completely in my eyes, not just Salafis. And I realized 15 years ago, I don't want to do this. That's why I quit from the institute I used to be a part of. I stopped teaching abstract theology, even as I remain passionate about it, which is why I put it on YouTube for academic talks called, my library chats. That's for academic stuff. I don't preach from the mimbar, istawa ala al-arsh. I don't bash other Muslims because they celebrate or don't celebrate the Mawlid. These are utterly abstract theoretical issues of no relevance. Lots of people feel this way now. And they feel this way, I would say, because certain aspects of Salafism appeal to them at a younger age, but as they matured and as they themselves grew intellectually and wisdom-wise experience within communities, they realized what attracted them to Salafism might have been good, but it wasn't sufficient to deal with the problems of their eras and populations and cultures and even their children. Frankly, my children growing up was one of the reasons why I had to rethink through some of these things. It's not solving their problems, right? So post-Salafism represents this phenomenon at a global level, and lots of people and institutes can be characterized like this, where the defining characteristics of Salafism, kalam, anti-kalam, sifat, have been relegated to the back. They're still there, because post-Salafis don't become, Ash'ari cosmologists, They're still there. I still don't preach kalam when I preach theology, but I don't make it a big deal. A person who subscribes to kalam is not an evil person in my eyes at all, like zero. It means nothing to me at all. Whether you're Ash'ari, Sufi, Maturidi, Ibadi, it means nothing to me. I want to see what is your relationship with Allah and how are you treating the other people. To me, that's the most important thing. Do you genuinely have love of Allah? which is manifested in your akhlaq and your ibadat. How you categorize the sifat, frankly, it's an abstract, interesting project that I'd love to do still to this day, but in closed doors, with advanced students, with graduate level students. Let's bring together Ash'aris, Maturidis, Ibadis, Zaydis, Mu'tazilis, Ithna Asharis. Let's lock them in a room that are experts in their theology, and let's hash it out. And then when it comes time for Dhuhr, let's go out and all pray together and have lunch together. That, to me, is what Post-Salafism represents, because what we really need to discuss when we have lunch is, how do we make sure that our kids love Islam? How do we make sure that we diminish the rates of ridda? How do we deal with the problems of disunity, of sectarianism, of racism, of how do we deal with the realities of politics in our times and representation? These are the problems. And neither Salafis nor Sufis can solve them if they insist on going back to Ibn Taymiyyah and Ghazali. It's not going to solve the problems of, our president right now in America, or your rising Islamophobia in Europe or whatnot. It's not going to be solved. But all fundamentalist movements, including Salafism, all fundamentalist movements have adapted a safety blanket, a child safety blanket. When they see the monsters, the imaginary monsters outside, in this case real monsters, they just cover themselves with that imaginary blanket, that blanket which is going back to the past. I can't discuss modern Islamophobia, khalas, let me discuss the sifat issue, because I'm comfortable doing that. I cannot solve the rise of the far right. Okay, you're a mubtadi' because you believe God is a jism and I don't believe God is a jism. That is familiar territory. It empowers me. It gives me something to do. And I have people on the other side that can also engage in that. And that's 1% of the ummah. And while I debate, 99% of the ummah is burning. I'm sorry. Post-Salafism understands this reality and calls a spade, calls out the nakedness of the emperor and says, guys, enough is enough. I really don't care about the Sifat controversy as a cultural issue. Believe it or not, I care about it as an intellectual phenomenon. I love it. But that's like geeky, nerdy YQ. That's not the preaching YQ anymore. It used to be 20 years ago. That's Post-Salafism. Post-Salafism wants to solve the problems that are more predominant and relevant, because the problems that Salafis bring and Ash'aris bring, they are only there because we bring them forth. Here's the irony of ironies. If Salafis and Ash'aris stopped talking about the sifat, it would cease to be a problem amongst the ummah. Think about it. The only people obsessed with the issue are the people who are obsessed with the issue.
Right.
That's it. So if we understand this point, and I attended a Amjad conference a few years ago, and it caused a big ruckus like 6-7 years ago, where I tried to bring these ideas. And I said, and this is online, you can see it. I said, as we are discussing in this room whether the Mawlid is bid'ah or non-bid'ah, our children are discussing whether the Prophet ﷺ is a role model or not because of ethical issues of the seerah. While we're discussing the attributes of God, our youth are discussing whether God exists or not. And if we don't understand this reality, the level of disconnect will continue to exacerbate and increase. And this is my pet peeve, not just about Salafism, but about all fundamentalist movements. Go log online to this day. What do Salafis do? They bash Yasir Qadhi over and over and over again. Khalas, I'm a deviant, understood. Now let's move on. Can you benefit the ummah? Okay, I agree with you if you wanted me to say so. From your perspective, I am. I agree with you. Your perspective is different. It's not Islam, but it's your perspective, I am. Khalas, can you do something other than refute, other than criticize, other than consider others to be deviant? Can you produce some wholesome tafsir of the Quran that your youth can listen to? Can you present the adab of Islam to a non-Muslim that they'll appreciate Islam? Unfortunately, what Salafis are obsessed with, and all fundamentalist movements, are specific issues that they deem to be the most important. And it's only important because they deem it to be, and they continue to regurgitate over and over again. So post-Salafism is the maturation of large groups of people from this type of thought, and then the moving on to address issues of actual relevance to the broader Muslim world and the community. But here's the clicker here. They're doing so having retained some aspects of that Salafi-esque thought. And I am also guilty of this or proud of it. To this day, I am not a strict madhabist. And I don't believe in, for me personally, I don't have a problem with the person following the madhab, and that's the default. The default of the average Muslim, they need to follow a madhab or taqleed of an authority. But my own life, I look up every issue and research it. That could be attributed to Ibn Taymiyyah, because that's not the typical mainstream nor to Sunnism. When it comes to aspects of creed, overall, still, I am sympathetic to early Hanbali thought, especially Ibn Qudama, frankly, more than Ibn Taymiyyah now. I'm more Ibn Qudama. Still, I think it makes the most sense, and let's just leave it at that. Just if Allah said it, leave the word and keep the word and leave the meaning to Allah. And I'm not sympathetic to kalam. That is a defining characteristic of Salafism. So this is what post-Salafism is. We retain some aspects, discard others, and move on to address modernity. And dare I say, if we look at the modern Western world at least, and maybe even the Eastern world, post-Salafism has seemed to have the most impact in the next generation of Muslims. And that is because just like third wave Salafism for its time presented authenticity and a revivalism and an excitement, now post-Salafism is doing the same. And it's doing so at a much more advanced, nuanced academic level. It's relevant. I thought Salafism was relevant in the 90s. Of course, now I realize it wasn't. But it's authentic, at least it's portraying itself as. It's exciting. It's empowering. So in many ways, post-Salafism is taking from certain aspects, but doing it in a very different playing field. Wallahu a'lam.
In terms of the future of Salafism and post-Salafism and its approach to theology and source criticism, I think one of the main things it has to engage with, and something that we engage with a lot on this channel, is historical critical scholarship that's occurring within Western academia and in Islamic studies more broadly. One example that I think is very relevant is one of the most notable scholars in Quranic studies employing the historical critical method, Nikolai Sinai, has concluded in his most recent book that actually the Salafi approach to the interpretation of the divine attributes is the one that is most in line with the clear reading of the Quranic text, and has even referred to Ibn Taymiyyah as an exemplary scholar in this regard. On the other hand, in the Western Academy, we have a very skeptical approach to the Hadith corpus and its ability to tell us anything really about the Prophet and actually what he did and said, which appears to be diametrically opposed to the Salafi theological emphasis on the Hadith canon. How do you think this sort of academic scholarship and also its increasing accessibility to lay believers will affect or influence the continued development of Salafi or post-Salafi thought?
That is a very difficult question because it's very sensitive and because there's no easy answer and because we are witnessing this in live time. It's a very difficult question. And it is a question that I myself am grappling with at a personal level, at a believing level, and as an academic, and as a preacher and teacher. Without a doubt, studying Islam in the madrasa and then studying in the academy has shaped me. And I've spoken about this in a lot more detail. I have a lecture online, if you're interested. It's called Between the Madrasa and the Academy. And I go over and I highlight that there's good and bad in both. And one of our problems is that most people in the madrasa and most people in the academy are refusing to acknowledge the good of the other. And they only concentrate on the negatives of the other. And as somebody who's lived in both and is still involved to this day in both, I still attend AMJA conferences I'm presenting and the other conferences I attend, and I still present papers, and I just published a book. This is my monograph. Had I still been in the academy, this would have got me my professorship. Alhamdulillah, I don't need to do that. I resigned. I resigned because of the pressure in the academy. I resigned because I can't speak about Israel in the academy. I resigned because my morality is subjugated to public opinion and polls. I can't preach in the mosque if I'm a member of the academy. My preaching of the mosque will impact my position in the academy. That's nonsensical to the academy, but that is the reality, right? So I am not a fan of creating animosity between these two strands. I actually believe it is important that both of them recognize that each one has much to offer the other. And I speak as somebody who's traversed both of them and respects both of them. There are also areas where we're going to have to agree to disagree. And we should be brave enough to just acknowledge it and move on. The origin of the Quran is one of them. I am a Muslim. When I'm preaching and teaching, I will use the Quran as evidence. End of story. When I'm presenting an academic paper, I understand for my audience, the Quran is not an evidence. I understand this. Doesn't mean I don't believe it in my life, but I will not then use it in the same way. And I'll become third person. Well, the Quran states this. Whereas, in a lecture, I'll say, Allah says. It's the same thing, but how you phrase it and the utilization is going to be slightly different. So in some areas, we're going to have to agree to disagree. As you're aware, and I think you have in your channel interviewed such people as well, many of the modern academics love to discuss the origin of the Quran, right? Of like the parallels of other, like the Alexander story, other stories, right? And their goal here, even if it's not explicit, is very clear. Their goal is to illustrate that the Prophet ﷺ was very crafty, very ingenious, that he tapped into all of these legends and then he constructed the Quran, right? That is an inherent bias of the Western Academy because they're refusing to acknowledge the theological presumption that we have. And that is, the Quran is inspiration from Allah. I believe this. And therefore, that type of talk will just not resonate with me because I'm not. So we have to agree to disagree. Hadith is another area. We're going to have to agree to disagree. There is no, now I hope there is, but as of yet, as somebody who's my undergraduate was in the College of Hadith. So I specialized, and it is said, and I'm not just saying because I'm a graduate, this was the well-known reality, that the College of Hadith in the University of Medina in the 90s and the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they've changed it now. It was considered to be the most advanced study of Hadith at the undergraduate level in the entire world. And as somebody who went through that and has talked to other people from other institutes, I would very much agree with that, the amount of studying that we did. So what I'm trying to say is I've studied Hadith inside out. I have ijazat more than I do. I forgot how many I have. I have plenty of ijazat. And I've also studied the historical critical method. In fact, for a period of my life, my second year of Yale, before I decided Ibn Taymiyyah, I really wanted to write a PhD on the isnad analysis and basically a Muslim defense of it, which would have been utilizing the historical critical method. So anyway, my point being, I'm well aware. My preliminary conclusion, and please audience understand, I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. My preliminary conclusion is there is no middle ground. And historical critical method and isnad analysis are two diametrically opposed ways of looking at early Islam and reports, and I don't find much commonality between them as of yet. Obviously in small areas, yeah, but overall, two diametrically opposed epistemologies. That having been said, therefore, one will have to navigate the religious side of things if you are a believing Sunni, Hadith believer, in a different epistemology. And when you are arguing in the academic world, you'll have to use a different epistemology. So in some areas, there's good, healthy overlap. In some areas, we'll politely agree to disagree. And in some areas, they're diametrically opposed. This is my preliminary analysis. and I would love to be proven wrong. And I would love for somebody to come and say, no, you are absolutely incorrect. And we can prove hadith via the historical critical method. And this is how we do it. And I would literally thank that person and be the first to buy the book and love to see it. As of yet, though, I'm a little bit pessimistic and I don't see there to be much of a commonality. So we're going to have to simply say, if you believe in the, that the sunnah has been preserved by the hadith, you're going to have to follow a certain epistemology, a certain paradigm. And if you are, like, as you're aware, and you're an academic channel, right? You're well aware, nobody in the academy affirms the Muslim Sunni science of hadith. Nobody. It is considered to be completely discredited. I'm just being factual. I'm describing. I'm not saying which one is right or wrong. I'm just saying the max you'll get, like Harold Motsky and others are going to say, well, we can say that some hadith definitely go back to some tabi'un. Mm-hmm. That's like the max you can say. Mm-hmm. As for definitively stating that the hadith go back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at this stage of my life, I will have to say, this is what I say as a believer, not as an academic. At this stage. And if somebody proves me wrong, then I would love to come across that and say, no, we can prove academically. Because here's the point. We can academically prove, by and large, that the Prophet ﷺ preached the Quran, the words that we have today. The Uthmanic Mus'haf, that's like a solid given, right? The wordings of the Quran, by and large, we can academically, of course, believers, we say that from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the academy has pretty much proven scientifically, through the historical critical method, that there's an Uthmanic Mus'haf. Yeah. That much is beyond reasonable doubt. And the fact that there's an Uthmanic Mus'haf, we're talking about senior companions all being alive, right? So by and large, the normative interpretation of the modern academy is that what the Quran claims to be, the wordings of the Quran, the preaching of the Quran, the teaching of the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ said them. This is the mainstream, and we can prove this. As of yet, I don't think we can do that to the hadith literature. And we're just going to have to understand these are two different epistemologies. So when I become Shaykh Yasir and I go and preach and teach, I will quote Sahih Bukhari and I will quote Sahih Muslim and I will say قال الله قال رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم, and that's the preacher. And I understand in the academy I cannot quote Bukhari and this will be what the Prophet said. I understand this, so I'm just going to have to use a different epistemology. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
Definitely. Yeah. As someone who has been considered the unofficial spokesman for mainstream Salafism in English for over 20 years, what is your relationship with the label Salafi today? And what is your advice to those who continue to see it as a core part of their religious identity?
So firstly, for the record, realize I didn't say I'm the unofficial spokesperson. Other people have said this. So some of my critics say that I'm putting myself above. I never claimed this, and that's not, there is no official or unofficial, but articles and academic journals and even at the time people would say stuff like this. So I never make this claim. That's a big claim to make. Let me just say I was extremely active in preaching and teaching for 2 decades of my life, because I started giving khutbahs and durus even before going to Medina in the mid-90s, and I continued very clearly on that trajectory and writing books, translating Ibn Taymiyyah, translating Abdul Wahhab. The first Kitab al-Tawheed translation, I did it. The first Qawaid al-Arba' and all of these books, I did them. And I taught through the institutes I was affiliated with. I physically taught concepts of Wahhabism, of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, to quite literally over 200,000 people, quite literally, because that was my full-time job. Every weekend traveling, and every class had on average 300, 400 people, full weekend seminars. And this is teaching Wahhabi theology. It's teaching Ibn Abdul Wahhab in modern English. We're literally talking about tawassul, tabarruk, istighatha. That was my class for a decade, So when people say that I was the unofficial spokesperson, I don't like that term. But I will say, quite factually, I was one of the main preachers and teachers of the movement academically and intellectually for quite a period of time. and my writings still are there, and my lectures from that phase are still there, and everybody knows this. That having been said, obviously, that's one of the reasons why when I moved on, I had to make a public notice about it. Say, hey, I no longer say these types of things, and it's not evil. Salafis want to prioritize the worship of God, so in some ways, you want them to say, let's not prostrate to graves. I agree. Why should you want to prostrate to a grave? You know, my issue comes when Salafis say, oh, but you're a kafir when you do that, right? That's where our issue comes here. So it's not as if I'm rejecting, it's just moving on. Now, your question was, what do I say of this label, and what is my relationship with the people in the movement? Obviously, the label, I never even used it, even when I was preaching and teaching publicly. I would sometimes call myself a pacifist Salafi, but even that was done to shock and awe the audience when they needed to hear that I'm coming from that. Otherwise, I didn't like the label, and I didn't use it. And of course, now I don't use it at all. But what I said in the book, at the end of the book, my perception of the actual first generations of Islam, which I think you quoted on your Twitter account, it's very clear to me that there was a vibrancy and an open-mindedness and a spectrum of ideas when it comes to so many issues. And that spectrum and that vibrancy seems to have been lost completely by the Salafi movement. So if by Salafi you mean small s, going back to the vibrancy, going back to the original thought, going back to the understanding that, hey, even if I have a viewpoint, my neighbor has a viewpoint, I don't like it, I'm going to say he's wrong, but what can I do? That's his version. If that's what you mean, then I think I am absolutely following that understanding of Islam. So call me a Salafi with a small s. No problem. The diversity, the ingenuity, because that generation had to extrapolate. That generation was original thought. That's what I admire and like. As for my relationship with the movement, I meet and greet everybody who wants to meet and greet me. That's not the case for some people, but in my case, anybody. And so there are people that are a part of the movement who have always found me to be problematic. We're talking about the ultra, hardcore, the madkhalis or whatever. They are, of course, known for this. That's not they were always opposed to me, even when I was preaching from the movement. And now, unfortunately, it's painful for me, but some people who I viewed to be mentors and colleagues and friends, they have, understandably, it's painful for them. I get it. Psychologically, I get it. When you firmly believe in something, and somebody whom you like or love, who used to believe in it, no longer believes in it, it will have a psychological impact. So it has impacted a number of my friendships, and sadly, even one of my main mentors and teachers in the Western world has basically considered it to be a part of his religious identity to boycott me in other than to say wa alaikum assalam, and that's it, because they think it's their version of Islam is that you cannot be kind to people of innovation. And I don't agree with that version of Islam. I definitely do not agree with it. But I see where it's coming from, and it is no doubt, not easy to deal with. But from my side, I'm polite to everybody. Even to this teacher, when I meet him, I still greet him and I still kiss him on the head, even though he doesn't like it. But I respect, he taught me, I owe a lot to him. And so from my side, I will always be kind and polite to everybody. I believe this is the prophetic way. I understand some Salafis don't, but that's my understanding of my Prophet ﷺ. And I'm more than happy to dialogue. I've appeared on many podcasts, some of whom were Salafis or previous Salafis, and I'm more than happy to dialogue. They're not evil people. They're good people. They passed the bar of salvation. All movements have. There's just certain issues I believe they should be more aware of and try to correct. And the same can be said of all movements of Islam. That's my whole point. There is no group of scholars that are the final arbiters of faith. No group of scholars. There's only one individual, and his name is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that we have to follow unconditionally. Everybody else, including Ibn Taymiyyah, much less the modern Salafi scholars, they're human beings. And so if I disagree, that should not make me an evil person. That's my opinion. And if you disagree with me, that doesn't make me an evil person either. Like I said, I define piety in a very different manner. Do you really love Allah and do you want to worship Allah? And do you treat the creation of Allah in the way that Allah wants you to treat them? That to me is the essence of piety. That's how I judge people. What your abstract theology is, even if I disagree, and even if I talk to you and say, I think you're wrong there, I don't need to be rude to you. I don't need to spit in your face. I don't need to boycott you. Sorry to be harsh, what a childish thing to do. Because I don't agree with your view, I'm going to turn my back on you. I'm not going to say salam. I don't find this to be befitting academically, religiously, spiritually. So I do disagree with those interpretations. But in the end of the day, I can't impose my will on other people, so they choose to live their lives as they want, and I will live my life as I. And in the end, we all are accountable to our Creator. And I hope and pray, all of us, even those that don't get along in this world, inshallah, all of us will enter up into Jannah. And once we're there, as Allah says in the Quran, وَنَزَعْنَا مَا فِي صُدُورٍ مِّن غِلٍّ, we're going to remove all the animosity in their hearts. That's what I'm looking forward to on that day, inshallah.
God willing. And on that note, Dr. Qadhi, thank you for your time to discuss your phenomenal book. I encourage all of our audience to go out and read it. It was a very enjoyable read, an easy read.
Free plug, here it is.
And I have it behind me myself. But yeah, if there's anything else that you would like to leave us with before we end this podcast, your time has been enjoyable. Your book has been phenomenal. The stage is yours.
The main caveat I always state, and I've said this in this interview as well, my goal is not to exacerbate any type of tension or sectarianism. Unfortunately, when you talk about trends, inevitably some issues do happen. My goal really is to achieve as much love and harmony and unity amongst the Muslims as possible, and to empathize with different strands. Even if you disagree, I am not saying all strands are the same. I'm not preaching relativism. What I am saying is that perhaps the differences have been exaggerated more than they need to. That's what I'm saying. And perhaps even if we disagree, we can still get along for other projects and good. That's what I'm saying. So Salafism, to conclude, is a very, very ancient strand of Sunni Islam. It predates the formation of Sunnism, actually, and it has been manifested in various iterations, and it has a lot of positives. However, it has also been quite amorphous and navigated and permutated through many different ways in different manifestations, which indicates the humanity of the movement. Once the modern practitioners understand this, they can understand, then maybe for their modern iteration, they can fine-tune it a little bit more, cut down some of the hostility against other movements. We understand that other movements have different definitions of Tawheed and Shirk. Even if they disagree, they can disagree with etiquette and adab and empathy. Say, I don't agree with you, but then say it with a smile and say, Allah will be our judge. That's all that I'm asking. I'm not asking for a radical revolutionary change in their theology. I'm simply asking for them to understand, just like past Salafis have evolved, they too should evolve for the modern times while they retain their core that will still identifiably categorize them within the movement. And in the end, as even Allah says, judgment belongs to Him alone. We cannot judge final affairs. Allah is the final judge. We can only judge abstract ideas and concepts to the best of our ijtihad. And our ijtihad is fallible. It's not infallible. With the same convictions the Salafis have of their theology, they need to understand all other strands of Islam have the same sincerity and the same conviction, and frankly, the same holistic interpretation that supports and justifies their understandings that Salafis do. That's one point that no fundamentalist movement really understands. Your fundamentalism is valid for you, and other people's fundamentalism is just as valid for them. That's what you don't understand. Once you get to this level, at least you empathize, remain as you are, and agree to disagree with civility. That is the message that I would like to give to those that are still subscribing, not just to this movement, but to any movement that believes that it alone is the final arbiter of the faith. I'm not asking you to radically change that. I'm simply saying, realize that is an opinion you hold, and other groups hold the exact same opinion with the exact same conviction and the exact same sincerity, and frankly, the exact same holistic buttressing of their ideas. The internal consistencies they have, you have, everybody has. So in my opinion, all of you have passed the bar of salvation as long as you believe in Allah, take the Prophet as a role model, and then attempt to live your lives in piety. And with that, inshallah, we will conclude. And I appreciate your time. And just for the record, I believe this is the longest interview I've ever done in my life. So alhamdulillah, that is a record for you guys and for me, inshallah.
All right, definitely a highlight. And thank you for your time, Dr. Qadhi. This was a phenomenal discussion with you. And we hope to speak to you again. Assalamu alaikum.
Inshallah. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum.
فيا ذلي ويا خجلي إذا ما قال لي ربي أما استحييته تعصيني ولا تخشى من العتب وتخفي الذنب عن خلقي وتأبى في الهوى قربي فتب مما جنيت عسى تعود إلى رضا